And now for our program. Dr. Christopher Marsicano, class of 2010, is the chair of the Educational Studies, and associate professor and the founding director of the College Crisis Initiative at Davidson. His research focuses on higher education policy and institutions as political actors. A frequent media contributor, his work has been published in top academic journals and featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and PBS NewsHour. He holds a PhD from Vanderbilt and an MPP from Duke. I'm now honored to turn the program over to Professor Dr. Marsicano, who will get us started. All yours.
Thank you so much, Judith, for having me and the C2i team today. Thank you, Carissa, for taking care of us as we go through a brief presentation and then open it up for questions. In case you didn't know what you were here for, this is the story of C2i. This is the story of the College Crisis Initiative, how Davidson College students took on COVID-19 and built a national center on higher education policy. Judith gave me a wonderful and kind introduction. If we can go to the next one, please, that would be great. Judith gave me a kind introduction. I'd like to introduce you to you all, the rest of the team, both past, present, and future. I'd like to first introduce Riley Martin, the former assistant director of the College Crisis Initiative. She specialized in her research on higher education governance, infrastructure, and equity. Before coming to C2i, she worked at the Habitat Humanity International and the Global Water and Sanitation Initiatives as part of Habitat for Humanity. Currently, she has left C2i and is now pursuing her Master's of Public Policy at Duke while managing the Duke Polarization Lab, which studies how we got to being a polarized society in the United States and how we can get back from that. I also want to point out Steve Mirabello, current student, class of 2025. He's a Belk Scholar and a politics, philosophy, and economics major. He became the youngest team leader in C2i history when he began spearheading research on college infrastructure and higher education unionization. You're going to hear a little bit of his work tonight. He is the distinction of being the only undergraduate ever to present at 3 Association for Education, Finance, and Policy conferences in the organization's 50-year history. And he co-founded Davidson Reads, which is a literacy program for local schools. He's a top ultimate Frisbee player, I will mention, and he's also studied social and racial inequity abroad in France, Northern Ireland, and in Japan. He's got a couple of different options for next year, but we'll make sure that that we ask him that question when it comes time for questions and answers. If we go to the next slide, I'd like to introduce you as well to our current assistant directors of C2i, old friends who were students at Davidson at one point and original members of the C2i team. Alexandria Marsicano is a visiting assistant professor and the assistant director of the College Crisis Initiative. She's from the class of 21 and was the 5th ever student employee of C2i. She was previously a Bloomberg Harvard City Hall Fellow, where she worked on sustainability and public policy in Knoxville. Her work has been featured in multiple municipal reports and also media outlets like Higher Education Dive. She holds a master's in education from Harvard and will begin law school at the University of Tennessee next fall. Louis Toledo is a founding C2i researcher. He was one of the first 3 C2i students ever, and he serves as assistant director of C2i. He co-authored C2i's first ever publication and previously worked in college admissions at Colby and at Davidson, leading partnerships and digital engagement. His research background includes education policy and mental health, and he's been featured in the Wall Street Journal and Business Insider. We're very thankful that we were able to coax Louis to leave the admission office and come across Main Street to join us this year. If we could go to the next slide, please. So the vision of the College Crisis Initiative, also known as C2i at Davidson, is that we aspire to be the nation's premier developer of undergraduate researchers in higher education and public policy. Our high-quality, data-driven research serves as the go-to resource for journalists, policymakers, scholars, and the general public. And so now that you have a sense of who we are and sort of what we're trying to do, I'd like to give you a little bit of a background of the story of how C2i came to be. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll ask everybody to remember where you were 5 years ago. And in our case, 5 years and 6 days ago. I was a baby assistant professor, a visiting assistant professor in the education studies department at Davidson. And I was lucky enough to have 3 research assistants. one of whom is here with us tonight, Louis Toledo. On March 11th, 2020, we received an email from the administration basically saying that Davidson was going to go online for the foreseeable future. That there was this new disease that was making the rounds called COVID-19, and that we would have to prepare to send our students home or send our students away from Davidson and shut down and transition immediately to online education. Now, I remember those moments like it was yesterday. I remember those moments because it was an extraordinarily difficult time. I famously, having gone through swine flu when I was a student at Davidson, said, "Oh, don't worry, we'll be back in a couple of weeks. It'll be fine." Little did I know, and really anyone at that point, that we would be leading to a multiple year lockdown where many people could not see each other, where it became harder to interact, and where higher education institutions, which have been following a business model of in-person teaching for literally 1,000 years, were beginning to have to figure out new ways of operating. So my research assistants, again, Lewis among them, Katie Felton and Madeline Butendorp, all came to my office before we knew we were supposed to be socially distancing. I want to make this very clear. We were following the rules at the time before we knew we were supposed to be socially distancing. And we had a discussion about how we were going to continue our research. And I remember something that is so quintessentially Davidson happening. At Davidson, we believe that we are developing students for lives of leadership and service. One of the three students said, "This is a massive problem, but we can't just sit back and act like things are normal. How can we lead here? How can we serve?" And thus began the process that led to the College Crisis Initiative. Chris, if you could go to the next slide, please. I have often said that the College Crisis Initiative could never have happened anywhere but a liberal arts college. And that is very clear to me because what's special about a liberal arts college is the interdisciplinarity of the way we think. My office is on a hall with classicists and Chinese scholars and economists and public health scholars and political philosophers. What is in the ether in this space is truly interdisciplinary and has this view that no one intellectual tradition holds a monopoly on good ideas. So as we're sitting there, we begin to think about different instances in history where we might have seen a similar issue to COVID-19. And if you're pretty well traveled in Northern Italy, you might recognize this castle here as being from the Italian city-state of Ferrara. Now, Ferrara holds a very important distinction, and I promise I will explain what it means for C2i in a moment. But Ferrara holds a very important distinction, and that is when the Black Death came to Northern Italy in the early 1600s, when Florence lost 9,000 people, and Milan lost 20,000 people, and Venice lost 40,000 people to the Black Death. Ferrara had just 2 cases and no loss of life, despite being directly in the middle of those 3 cities. Now, one of the great things about a liberal arts college, leaning on the humanistic tradition, leaning on history, allows us to go back and see what is it that Ferrara did that made it so successful during these times. Chris, if we could go to the next slide, please. And we looked at what Ferrara was able to do. This is the coat of arms of Ferrara, on which the College Crisis Initiative logo is based. What Ferrara did was it controlled mobility in and out of the city. It stopped allowing people in from areas where there was where the plague had come up. And there was robust testing. Doctors with plague masks would go around checking people for boils. There was sharing of information where Ferrara would send out people to the neighboring cities to understand what was going on with respect to the Black Death and its spread. And there was also this sense of building a community. Ferrara against the world was the phrase. Well, Lewis and Katie and Maddie and I sat there and we thought, okay, well, if this is the playbook, if this is the model of how to deal with a global pandemic, what is it that we can do? Now, I'm 5'8" on a good day. I'm not a great bouncer. I can't keep sick people off the campus. So clearly controlling student mobility was not going to be something that we as Davidson students and a faculty member could do. I have a doctorate, but it's not a medical doctorate. The chances of me ever coming up with an antigen test were pretty low. So it wasn't going to be testing. We could build a sense of community among us, but not across the world. But what we could really do is share information. So we began the process of collecting information on what colleges and universities across the country were doing at the beginning of this time. We quickly, over a period of about 2 weeks, wrote a paper that showed that colleges were shifting rapidly to online education. And that paper we posted on the American Political Science Association preprint website. Within 72 hours, it became the most downloaded paper in the history of that website. Now, that sounds really impressive. The website was only about 3 months old at this time, so it's not as impressive as you might think. But what it did do is it did let us know that there was, in fact, an appetite for this information. We were very lucky that at the same time we were doing this work, a man by the name of Jeff Silingo, who is a former higher education writer, sort of public intellectual around higher education, was writing a book about Davidson's admission process and was looking to connect uh, various different foundations with people who are working on getting higher education through the COVID pandemic. He reached out to us. We were able to have meetings with the ECMC Foundation, which gave us initial funding to begin our work in understanding how COVID operates and how higher education institutions were innovating in times of COVID. Next slide, please, Carissa. So that's what we have here is this sense of this origin story. Every great comic book hero has an origin story, so does every villain. But the origin story of C2i is basically this, that a group of well-meaning students looked to the past and took their data collection skills and put them together to create the College Crisis Initiative. I should mention that this process didn't happen without extraordinary help. We are very thankful that the now Dean of Data at Davidson, Laurie Heyer, and her Pronto team were able to develop with us and for us, mostly with her team, a web tracker that effectively looked at college websites every morning at midnight and saw how much of the text on those websites changed. There was a lot of text that changed. Our team of then 72 College Crisis Initiative students, by the time we had received our initial funding, would go out and catalog those changes, which allowed us to have up to the day information about what was happening on college campuses. Were colleges online? Were they in person? Did they have mask requirements? Did they have vaccine requirements? And on and on. Without the help and support of not just our colleagues in computer science and data science, but also the generous gift from the Amsterdam family and support from President Quillen, we could not have done anything that we are about to talk about today. And what we did do, I think, was pretty spectacular. If you'll go to the next slide, Carissa, what everyone will see here is our dashboard. We hit the dashboard craze with everybody else during COVID-19. And with the help, again, of Laurie Heyer's Project Pronto students, we were able to produce the data that they then turned into this dashboard, which became a go-to source for college media, for papers of record as to what colleges and universities were doing. It allowed us to have an outsized influence on the way that colleges and universities operated during the pandemic. And we also were able to build strong partnerships across the country. If you'll go to the next slide, please, Carissa. You'll see that our research became extraordinarily important to multiple different institutions. UNC Greensboro, Washington, Indiana, and Davidson collaborated using mobility data, cell phone location data, which we'll talk about later in the presentation here, to find that student mobility led to 8,000 additional COVID-19 cases and 100 deaths per day in college towns around the community or across the country. It was a group of tough, never say die, scrappy 18 to 22-year-olds that collected the data and worked on the project that let us know how colleges were responding to COVID-19 and how the disease was spread. We were picked up by the Wall Street Journal. We were picked up by the New York Times. And that information meant that we had more and more people coming to us over and over and over again, which led to more collaborations. Carissa, if you could go to the next slide, please. A lot of those collaborations were with researchers. We paired our students, who I should mention, we paid. Every single one of these students received academic credit at this time or were paid. We don't take volunteer work. We exclusively take paid work. And that is still the case today. Every single one of these students was given the opportunity to collect data, to do data analytics and analysis that then partnered with external partners that allowed us to produce research that showed, in the case of the We Want You Back paper, that politics, not actual cases numbers on the ground, led to instructional operations decisions, that colleges tended to follow a handful of other schools in terms of what they were doing. When a college is uncertain as to whether or not it should have a vaccine policy or a mask policy, it looked to its peers. We were able to see that there was extraordinary learning loss and that students were had different enrollment patterns when they left high school and went into college. So all of this happened simply because we had students like Steve Mirabello today and students like then Alex Marsico-Viteri working on these projects to make sure that the data were clean and ready to go and ready for use by not just researchers, but also the CDC and the White House and HHS. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lewis to talk a little bit about media operations, and I'll talk with all of you again at the end.
Thank you, Chris. And then, Chris, if we could go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the media partnerships that came from this time. But before I get to talk about a little bit of the examples that we had, I want to invite you into how I think about this. What does it mean specifically for Davidson students to get to do this work, to have contact with the media, and how it helps them in the future? I think that C2i provided a template for, yes, how to deal with like times of crisis, but then also something that could be applied to professional development for students, so that they're ready to like face any crisis. Now, we wanted to use the strengths and the privilege that we had, honestly, as an institution at Davidson. And number one is that we have the privilege of a small community that is all about thinking. And it was a time of chaos where everyone was trying to make sense of what was even happening around them. So thanks to all the data collectors that we had as an organization getting to do the work, we're able to partner with the Chronicle of Higher Education to understand what was going to happen in the future and the plans to reopen for each college campus. This really provided an opportunity for students to understand not only where their institutions fell in the future, but also how does it compare to how like the rest of the world is learning. A small community like Davidson is very much about connection. And even for students that were at different institutions, they were still having the shared experience of going through the pandemic. So making sense of where you are as a student, I think was one of the strengths of the College Crisis Initiative at the time. Also, we wanted to really use the strengths of Davidson students specifically. And I guess everyone on this call knows that Davidson students are great agenda setters. When Davidson students care about something, they will let you know and they will make sure that everyone knows. So that's really where our strength came in, right? Making sure that we were putting students at the forefront and making sure that they're able to talk to the media, because even though they were only undergrads at the time, there is no greatest merit than doing the work. And in that case, I was still like an undergrad getting to do that data collection, getting to spend hours and hours on websites and understanding how not only how colleges are reacting, but also how they talk about how they're reacting to the pandemic itself and what their plans were. And Karis, if you want to go to the next slide. So we just wanted to get the word out there. These are all media outlets that, yes, our leadership staff, but also directly our students have been able to contribute to, whether it is through our data or being able to be interviewed by them, not only as students, but as experts in the field. Then we saw the strength of a small community once again. Community where our students were used to talking to leaders in their fields. When you get to go to a talk, you get to be part of a Q&A, and you have that opportunity to talk to the UN ambassador as part of your class. So being part of a community where students were used to having the important conversations, I think got rid of some of those barriers that students in undergrad may have, or perhaps they may hesitate before talking to the media. But we also wanted to take that into the next step, which is having a voice not only as a student or somewhere where there may be a power structure, but actually having a voice and a place at the table. So that really allowed our students to be interviewed as experts. And when I think about my experience at the College Crisis Initiative, I remember being 21 years old. I had just had like my Zoom graduation. And I got to hop on a call with the Wall Street Journal to be interviewed, not necessarily as a student. They were aware of the fact that I had been a student in the past, but rather answering questions as an expert. And I think that was really the moment that allowed me to understand my place in academia and my place in making change happen. Right. And that is one of the things that we really want to empower our students to do. Yes, that was able to happen back then with the COVID-19 pandemic, but we really want all of our undergraduates to be ready to tap into their fields in the future and be able to do that work. Now, having this connection to the outside world, I think gives our students the power of perspective as well. Because once you get to be on those calls, once you get to be at that table, any challenge that you get to have in the future seems way less scary. I remember having my first opportunity to talk in our committee room when I was part of the admission team here at Davidson. And not only thanks to the strength of that team, but also having had this experience talking to the media, I had a better idea of what it meant to have a voice in the room where decisions are being made, or well, the room where it happens. And we really want our students to be empowered to do that, because we think that there needs to be more data-driven decision making and policy. And the people that should be in the room are the ones doing the work, the ones that have taken the time to look at what all institutions are doing in multiple perspectives and multiple angles. Now, I will go ahead and turn things over to Alex Marshall today to talk a little bit more about how we empower students as they go forward.
Thank you so much, Louis. And if anybody's interested, I feel like we all have such a beautiful anecdote from our time in C2i, and moreover, the belief that Dr. Marsicano has put in each of us and the community that's been built through that. So if during Q&A you're interested in further anecdotes, all of us have some great stories to share. And as a perfect segue into professional development, I'd like to note that many of the media mentions that Louis shared, featured on previous slides, include C2i students themselves. Needless to say, that level of exposure as an undergraduate is very impactful. At C2i, we firmly believe that our undergraduates are our biggest advantage, and we seek opportunities to uplift their fantastic work to stages typically reserved for graduate students, researchers, policymakers, and the like. Conferences, as detailed on our slide here, comprise one of the many areas where our students not only brush up against the shoulders of giants, but truly stand in a league of their own. And in alignment with the old adage, show, don't just tell, I'd like to highlight a very brief example. To the best of our knowledge, there have been 14 undergraduates who have ever presented at the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy Conference in its 50-year-long history. Might I add that this is one of the top conferences in the field of education policy. 13 of those undergraduate students were from our C2i team, and all 14 were Davidson students. In fact, as Dr. Marsicano highlighted at the beginning of our call, Steve Mirabello, who is with us here tonight, became the first undergraduate to present at the conference in successive years. We empower our students to pursue those impactful opportunities and also equip them with the offerings to build the skills necessary to arrive there through our professional development programming. As a quick overview, we offer training and workshops for students to develop their research skills across several core competencies, including data analysis, leadership, communication, and collaboration. From policy memo workshops, where students learn how to translate findings into evidence-based policy recommendations, to project management training that offers helpful tools and principles for leading the intricate tasks of a full data collection, we at C2i actively seek ways to develop our team and provide them with opportunities to develop research agendas of their own. Which brings me to my next slide on our research projects. Alongside other collections, we support students in turning their own interests into research questions and identifying the specific data needed to address their questions and generate broader insights. We've highlighted two student collections here, Valentina Solardi's collection on the resources and capacities of Title IX offices on college and university campuses, and Thomas Lane's current collection examining the pre-health resources publicly available on college and university websites. Naturally, these are two of the many examples that we have of students developing their own research agendas and leading their own collections. And as part of our mission, we respond to crises and changes that affect the higher education landscape. To that effect, our leadership team led a collection to survey the impact of Hurricane Helene on colleges and universities in affected states. We gathered data on school closures, reopening plans, and relief resources to inform discourse on future disaster response strategies in higher education. This semester, in response to President Trump's executive order threatening the existence of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, we also launched a timely collection to capture the current state of diversity, equity, and inclusion infrastructure across U.S. institutions of higher education, including data points on the presence of DEI offices and leadership positions. This collection will develop a baseline for tracking changes in DEI-related resources and messaging over time. Overall, these are just a quick sampling of the 15 collections, nearly 15 collections that we've conducted this academic year alone, and we look forward to staying in conversation with you all as we develop research briefs on all of this data over the summer. And now I will turn it over to our next fabulous presenter.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about a project I've been working on for the better part of the last 2 years now, about unionizations in higher education. And this is a paper that I wrote with Riley and Dr. Marsicano that's received a revise and resubmit from Educational Researcher, which is one of the top education journals in the country. And for the next slide, we started this in the summer of 2022, and I was on Davidson College's campus for that summer, which is a bizarre experience if any of you have ever done it, just empty. And Dr. M and Riley gave us all of the students who were working there for C2i over the summer a pretty broad mandate to research whatever topic we were interested in, come up with a research agenda, they would fund it and they would support it. And I was really interested in that time in issues around labor and labor organizing. Coming out of the COVID pandemic, unions were a big topic in American society. You saw prominent organizing efforts at Amazon, at Starbucks, at the big three automakers, and you also saw it in universities. Notably, the Dartmouth men's basketball team became the first student athletes to try to unionize. And you saw headlines around a new era of union activism in higher ed. So I wanted to study that. And when we looked at the literature out there, we saw that there really wasn't anybody looking at staff and staff at universities who form the backbone of university operations. There were some people researching contingent faculty, some people researching graduate student workers and undergraduate student workers, but nobody who was looking at staff. And we wanted to change that. So for the next slide, we made a database using federal government data and data from other sources of all the unionizations that happened in American private higher education between 2007 and 2023. And we started analyzing it, and we've been analyzing it for the last 2 years now. And here's some highlights that we found. So in American private higher education, and of the efforts to unionize, about 30% of those were contingent faculty, adjuncts, part-time assistant professors. The majority of them, though, were staff, and the number one group who's trying to unionize in American universities over the last couple of decades has been campus safety, campus police. In this post-COVID landscape, we see residence life workers and research assistants as the most prominent groups. So if we go to the next slide, we can see those groups tend to be student workers. It tends to be students who are serving as residence advisors, residence assistants, who are working as research assistants. That's both undergraduate and graduate. And so many students are unionizing that it's about 45% of all the union elections in 2022 and 2023 were led by students. And this is a real shift in the landscape because you had a ruling by the National Labor Relations Board, which is the federal agency that governs unionization efforts in the private sector, in 2016 that allowed students to start unionizing, and you've really seen them take up that opportunity in the post-COVID landscape. And for the next slide, a lot of the attention has been on contingent faculty historically, and for good reason. Compared to tenure track and tenured faculty, they almost always have lower pay, lower job security, less say in faculty governance. And one of the ways they try to address that is through unionizing. And the heyday for those efforts was between 2014 and 2016 or 17, where they comprised over half of voting units in every year. And this aligns with an effort by a major American union, the SEIU, to really target contingent faculty in their efforts. And you see that play out in the data. Recently, however, post 2020, they've made up a much smaller portion of employees included in voting units. And for the next slide. So a couple of the key takeaways that we found, despite the little attention they receive, it's really staff members at colleges and universities that make up the majority of employees seeking to unionize. Contingent faculty, like we discussed, represent about a third of the employees seeking to unionize. And really interestingly, just 7 states in the District of Columbia account for 80% of all unionization attempts in American private higher education. And if you look at those 7 states, it reads like the 7 bluest states in America, pretty much. And for our takeaways, we think it's very important to shed light on these other key campus constituencies that have historically not been studied, and we're pursuing further research papers on those very topics. And I'll turn it over to Riley.
Thanks, Steve. So now I'm going to talk about a research paper that I worked on back when I was working with C2i that looks at the impact of student movement during the COVID-19 pandemic on the 2020 census count. And this paper uses what I think is a really innovative data source, which is cell phone location data, which might sound a little bit creepy, but hopefully by the end of the presentation, you'll see that this is a really interesting data source to use to answer some questions about higher education and public policy. All right, so if we go to the next slide, you'll see a ton of headlines that you probably saw back in 2020. We've got May 11th, World Health Organization is announcing COVID-19 as a pandemic. A few weeks later, April 1st is Census Day. And so there were a lot of people that I think were pretty skeptical about how the Census Bureau was going to carry out this constitutionally mandated count in the face of the pandemic. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see the 2020 count has taken place. And there starts to be some anecdotal evidence that college towns in particular were undercounted relative to 2020 estimates of what their populations should be. And so one reason for this skepticism is likely that college students are supposed to be counted in their college towns. Under normal circumstances, that would have been where they were counted. We've got the pandemic, and a ton of students are relocating to different states. And so what is the impact of all these students moving from where they normally would have been counted in their college towns to different states around the country? And so this table just shows some of the early evidence that college towns may have been undercounted in the 2020 census. The next slide just talks through how we actually figured out who these college students were. So we used anonymized cell phone location data, which comes from the many apps that we have that send pings of our locations. that we can then use to figure out where people are and where they're going. And so what we're able to do is figure out where people spend most of their time, and then we assign that as their home location. And so you'll see on this graph here, Davidson College, this is a person who spends most of their time presumably at F in their apartment there. And so the next slide, you'll see we map on a shape file of a college campus on top of all these little dots, which are people's cell phones or their location. And then we can figure out which devices are college students. And then we know that these are college students residing on a college campuses. And then we can see where they're moving in and out of these different shape files. So next slide, please. So understandably, there's some normal movement. People go across the street to Kindred, they go to Brick House. So we expect to see some movement, especially on weekends. But what is not normal is devices leaving their college shapefile for a while. And it's not normal to see those devices leave and stay in a different state. And so this method is how we're understanding where students were at their home location. And then we see them leave that shapefile and go to a different state when they're sent home during the COVID-19 pandemic. So on the next slide, you'll see some of our main results here. These two maps are just showing the inflow and outflows of people from each state. And then panel C here on the right is the net effects of the cross-state movement. So the purple bars at the top that are positive values are states that were undercounted in the census relative to a world where those college students were counted in their college towns. And then the purple negatives at the bottom are states that were overcounted. And so we see Illinois was likely overcounted in the census, for example, and Pennsylvania undercounted. So all of this net movement across states, we find led to college counties being undercounted by 2% relative to non-college counties. What does 2% really mean in practice? Well, as you'll see in the next slide, the census determines congressional apportionment, so how many seats in the House of Representatives each states get. And so we'll see here on the left column, actual reapportionment is what happened in real life. And then the three columns to the right, half, simulated, and double, are different simulations basically showing what would have happened in the absence of this movement during the pandemic. And so if you take a look at New York, you'll see that they would not have lost a seat, and then Minnesota would not have gained a seat. And so there was some real, political power consequences of this student movement during the pandemic. And I'll pass it back to Chris to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Riley and Steve and Alex and Lewis. I have to say, one of the great joys of my life has been able to work with these people and all of the people that are students and alumni related to C2i. I see a couple of names on the chat that I recognize, not just former student names, but the parents of students. Joe and Kim, just know that Abby did an excellent job at AEFP this week. She was unreal good at her presentation. So we're so thankful, to Lewis's earlier point about community, to have so many great backers and supporters among you, the Davidson community at large, whether you be parents, whether you be alumni, whether you be current students or faculty or staff. Without you, we could not do what we do. And with that, I will open up the floor to questions, although we don't have any questions in the Q&A function at this point. So either we're exceptionally boring or doing a really good job of explaining things, and I refuse to be boring. So I'm going to hope that it is the latter. Seeing no questions, I think I could probably start us off with one, if that's okay. Let's go a question for all of you. What is your, in 10 words, 10 to 15 words, what is your greatest memory of C2i and the work you've done here? Let's start with Steve, since it's freshest in his mind.
And while Steve's preparing to answer, yes, folks on the call, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function as Chris was mentioning. So don't be shy. If not, he may just call on you like a classroom.
Yeah, I think the single coolest thing was taking a question that I've asked in classes and in theory, and having the ability to research it and write a paper based off of it and present it at a conference, all thanks to C2i.
I will also mention for Steve that paper is under review at Educational Researcher, received revise and resubmit. And for those in education, Educational Researcher is certainly top 5, if not the best journal in education in the country. So Steve's got a great path ahead of him for that paper. Not to be outdone, we have another student, Abigail Reardon, also at AAFP, who's working up a paper to also submit to that journal. So it's not just, Steve is not just the only one who's doing this great work. Let's go with Lewis next.
I mean, I think there are a few, but the word that comes to mind is being able to say yes. I remember the first time that I wanted to do research at Davidson, and 12 folks say yes to that and say yes to like my ideas and want to pursue them really meant a lot. And then having the ability to be that yes for other students now, so an assistant director really, I think it's a nice way to one, like pay it forward, but then know that there's really no limit or a specific timeline that you have to follow when you want to have impact and get to work with other students and to be able to influence other students. Alex next.
So I have a couple. I'll be short. One was that my sister transferred into Davidson and then later joined the C2i team. And as first generation college students, it was nice to share that experience together and being exposed to what education research could look like. And then kind of going off of Steve's point and Lewis's point of getting that yes and having someone who truly believes in your ability to produce high quality work. I got to lead the efforts on the law school dashboard and reopening. So combining my efforts in the legal field with data and research through C2i was just something that I'll never forget. And I'm deeply grateful for.
And Riley?
Yeah, I think my kind of rewarding moment is the flip side of Steve's, and it's just being on the other side of that, watching Steve and the other students' growth and confidence build in their ability to do the research and be the people presenting this at conferences was extremely rewarding. And to see their progress is something that I'll never forget.
I'll add, I second everything that's been said about helping students develop good research questions, go out there and live lives of consequence through that research. But I will also say to Lewis's discussion earlier about media, I think my 2 favorite media memories are when I talked to a crisis communicator, professional crisis communicator and marketing person. And I told her that we were training up Davidson students to be the experts to talk with the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and Higher Ed Dive and all these places. And she said, "You let students talk to the media by yourself? There are CEOs I don't let do that." And I said, "It's not that I let students, it's that we couldn't help but to put them forward. They are the experts. They are the ones who know this material better than anyone else." The second thing I would say is if you ask any student who was around at those early days, if you ask them what was the most difficult interview you ever had in the media, what was the toughest outlet, the answer, undeniably, every time was Teen Vogue. It wasn't CNN, it wasn't Fox News. Folks, the researchers, the journalists at Teen Vogue do their research and they are ready to ask those questions. So we do have a lot of, we're beginning to get some new questions here. And so, oh my goodness, we got a question from another AAFP attendee parent from Ramona Schreiber, Sarah Butchko's mom. Sarah Butchko, another one who presented so well at AAFP. Her work on DEI efforts in dance was widely lauded by those in attendance. I will go ahead and ask this question, and I think I'm gonna give this one to, let's go with Lewis and Alex. Either one of you can jump in on this one. With the dire conditions around the Department of Education, do you see risks of data losses, data access losses to support C2i education research? And of course, because she's the lovely mother of Sarah Butchko, she thanked us for our answer. So Lewis and Alex, what do you think?
Yes. Sure answer, yes. But I think one of the things that keeps me going and wanting to do this work is to know that no one has a monopoly on good ideas. And I think like that's part of like C2i at its core. And that really allows us to understand the need for there to be data everywhere. It doesn't have to live in one place, but rather there should be access to it so that folks can ask their questions. So I now realize that the work that we have been doing so far, wanting to build a structure that has like data somewhere where he lives that we get to own. I realize now how important it was. Perhaps like 5-10 years ago, we would not have like imagined that the data that we usually get from federal entities will ever go away. But knowing that that's a real possibility, I think underlines the importance of building different structures and different bodies of work and national centers that we can go to.
Absolutely. And since Lewis covered the data point, I'd also like to use an interesting pedagogical aspect of this question, which is, as we discuss education policy, where does the locus of authority sit for various different decisions or different impacts? What does the U.S. Department of Education actually do? And what does a dismantling of the department and cuts to staff, what does that actually mean for education broadly? What's handled at the state level and district level? I think that Lewis answered the data losses and access piece, but it also opens up a really neat conversation about advocacy in the policy space as we talk to students about what does this mean, not only for us here at Davidson, but for your districts back home that you're coming from as well.
Yeah, I'll just also add, we were in DC last week for this education research conference we keep talking about. And on Tuesday, the night we were hosting an alumni association event in Washington, that was the day in which the administration announced the layoffs at the Department of Education. So they had already announced ending certain surveys and ending certain data points, data sets, but they had not yet announced the layoffs. And while we were in the room, there were people in the room and as part of that event who were finding out that people they cared about had lost their jobs. It was harrowing to be there talking about education data and our capacity to do education data, to get good quality data from these incredibly hardworking, brilliant, talented students. And also know that the people who made that data for the federal government no longer have their jobs. And in that moment, we started talking with the alumni in attendance and basically said, what a moment not for us to shy away, to worry about risks to C2i, but what a moment again for us to stand up. What a moment again for Davidson to take the lead and to say, no, we will collect those data. So the very next day, we downloaded the entire institution level data set that the federal government uses on colleges and universities from 1983 until today. It's called the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data Set. It now lives on our Google Drive folder. It's not one of the biggest ones. It's not one of the restricted ones, but it is one that we want to make sure we still have access to. And we are continuing to do the work of collecting the data that we need to collect in order to make sure that we can pick up the flag of the work that the Department of Education used to do and run with it. And we're not the only ones, I should mention. The University of Michigan is working on some of these issues. The University of Massachusetts is working on some of these issues. We are trying to piece together and pull the data sets that exist and then add our own work to them. I think we've answered the question about that. Tom Kernbauer, who works at Davidson and is a lovely colleague of ours, asked a similar question. Tom, can you give me a thumbs up as to whether or not that we answered your question? Okay, we got it. We got a thumbs up for answering the question, and I will open up the question. Open up questions more. We have time for at least one full question. There are a lot of educators on this call. People like Tim Saint Singh and Pete Benbow. They know about wait time, which is this idea that you wait until people jump in and ask a question, give them time to think through. I am no stranger to wait time. I love it. If we need to be spending 6 minutes quiet here until the session ends, I will do it, y'all. All right, look at that. And Tim Saintsing comes through with a question. Wait time works, folks. The question is, how do you ensure that the data you're collecting through C2i, like the DEI and higher education data you seem to be collecting, for instance, will be used by good actors, not bad actors? Can you ensure such things? It's a fantastic question. How can you be sure that the data are used by good actors, not bad actors? Can you ensure such things? The answer to that question is complicated. It is a mostly yes, but really no, is the best way I would answer that question. We retain ownership of the data. We only share the raw data with partners who have agreed to mentor our students. So we have in the past, and we are working on sort of reinvigorating it, a research affiliates program where scholars who agree to take on students as co-authors or work with them to create dashboards or write reports, they're the only ones who get access to the data, with the notable exception of a couple of entities who have purchased the data. We typically make deals with those external partners to ensure that there's ethical use of data. So for instance, Riley was mentioning the mobility data, the cell phone data. We have the geolocation records of 100 million cell phones and up to the second where they are from 2018 until 2023. That is a really important data set. That is a data set that has some serious ethical implications to it. The agreement that we have with the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where this works, is that the head of their team and the head of our team, in this case right now, me, can at any point pull the plug. Effectively, C2i is running point on sort of paying and financing those data. UNC Greensboro runs the actual sets up the actual analysis of those data. So at any point, we can pull the plug on the funding stream that makes that work. And at any point, they can say, no, we're not doing that. You don't have access. So we try to build in our relationships with others the kind of work, the kind of safeguards so that nobody could use the data in a way that we don't intend it to be used. We also will do some basic things around data, like aggregating to higher levels, right? These are common data procedures. So for example, a number of C2i co-authors worked on a paper around changes in mobility and transitions around abortion issues. When Texas had a much stronger a much more punitive, I guess I should say, anti-abortion policy, what did that do? And so rather than say we see people using, we see these people's cell phones going from Planned Parenthoods in Texas to new locations outside of Texas, and specifically the specific locations, we, number one, don't go to location, we look at the Starbucks across the street, right? Like we go to places where it's not the sensitive locations. And number two, we aggregate at the state level. So we can tell you what states they're going to, but not what individual locations they're going to. Those are just some of the processes, Tim, that we use. And we never post our full data sets. We post aggregate analyses and bar graphs like the one Steve showed you, but we don't make those data available for anybody, which candidly we've gotten some heat for in the data science community, right? It is not necessarily best practices to not provide replication data. But I'm open to being convinced that this is not the right way of doing things. But right now we're pretty protective of our data, not just because of the ethical considerations, but also because our students worked hard to collect it. We want to make sure they get something out of it before anybody else does.
Any other questions for this amazing panel? Well,
we're happy to take any questions via email, c2i@davidson.edu. And of course, our emails are all available. So if you want to follow up with us at some other time, we'd love to hear.
Yes, and panel, you should know this is the first call where I've seen where folks did not start dropping off. So clearly folks are very much listening to everything that you have to say.
Good. The bribes to get people here worked. That's great to hear.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, Lewis, Riley, Alex, and Steve, for taking the time to lead us all in this discussion tonight. Lots to think about for sure. We'll send a follow-up email in the next few days to those who were on the call with a short survey and some other helpful information. This event was recorded. So by the end of the week, if you want to look back on the back to school website, and we'll again link that in the follow-up email, this recording of this class will be there. So if anyone wants to listen to part or all of this or want to share it with folks who you know may be interested and weren't able to join us tonight, it'll be on the college's YouTube channel. We're happy to have folks be able to take advantage of it that way. We are grateful for everyone who dialed in this evening and really hope that everyone enjoys the rest of their evening in this beautiful week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.